What if the biggest political debates you see on television don't actually matter? What if elections change faces, parties change slogans? Policies change names, but the real decisions about money were already made decades ago, behind closed doors by people you never voted for. Here's the uncomfortable mystery. Governments say they borrow money to help citizens. Banks say they lend money to support economies. Yet every decade, debt grows faster than populations, faster than productivity, faster than reality itself. So here's the question no one asks out loud. If governments rule countries and banks just support them, why do governments behave like debtors and banks behave like rulers? Tonight, we're uncovering the secret deal between banks and governments you were never told how it began, how it evolved, why it can't stop, and why it may already be reaching a breaking point. Stay with me, because the answer doesn't appear where you expect it. Setting the stage, how money really entered power. To understand the deal, we need to go back before credit cards, before national budgets, before modern democracy itself. For most of human history, governments created money directly. Kings minted coins, empires collected taxes and metal. Money was tangible, scarce, and painfully slow to create. But there was a problem. War. Wars were expensive. Armies needed food, weapons, and loyalty. Raising taxes took time. Printing metal required resources, and losing a war meant losing everything. That's when rulers discovered something revolutionary: borrowing power instead of creating it. Early banks' private institutions began lending money to governments in exchange for interest and political privileges. At first, this seemed harmless. Temporary loans, emergency funding, practical solution. But that temporary solution quietly changed everything. Because once a government borrows money, it becomes something new, not just a ruler, but a debtor. And debt changes behavior. Origins, the first unwritten agreement, the real origin of the secret deal, wasn't a signed document. It was a dependency. In the 1600s, European governments realized banks could create credit faster than states could raise taxes. The most famous example was the creation of central banking itself, institutions designed to fund governments when they couldn't. Fund themselves. The deal worked like this. Governments received instant money without raising taxes. Banks received interest, legal protection, and monopoly privileges. But here's the twist. That money wasn't backed by gold at first. It was backed by future taxation. In other words, citizens, most of whom had no voice, became collateral. From that moment on, governments stopped being the sole creators of money. They became clients of the banking system. And once money creation moved into private hands, political power quietly followed. The rise when debt became policy. Fast forward to the 20th century. 2 world wars devastated economies. Governments needed massive funding fast. Banks and central institutions stepped in again, but this time on a global scale. This era created 3 major changes. First, permanent national debt became normal. Debt was no longer an emergency tool, it became policy. Second, central banks gained independence from governments, at least officially. In reality, this meant governments could no longer directly control money creation. Third, money detached from physical value entirely. When currencies left the gold standard, something extraordinary happened. Money could now be created through debt alone. Governments didn't print money, they issued bonds. Banks bought those bonds. Central banks supported banks. It looked circular, sounded stable, but underneath, the deal was clear. Governments promised endless repayment. Banks promised endless credit, and the public was never asked if this system should exist. Cause and effect, WHY, this deal never ends. Here's the critical mechanic most people never learn. Governments do not borrow existing money. They borrow newly created money. When banks buy government debt, they often create that money digitally out of nothing, then charge interest on it. So where does the interest come from? It doesn't exist yet. Which means governments must borrow more money, just to pay interest on previous money. This creates a structural trap. Even if a government balances its budget perfectly, the interest remains. Even if citizens work harder, produce more, and save more, the debt grows. The deal guarantees one thing: debt can never be fully repaid. And systems that cannot be repaid are not financial tools, they are control mechanisms. The breaking point: when the system shows cracks every few decades, the system overheats. Debt grows too large, asset bubbles inflate, confidence breaks. Then comes the crisis. Recessions, financial crashes, currency collapses, they're often presented as unpredictable disasters. But look closer, and you'll see a pattern. Banks take risks. Governments guarantee bailouts. Central banks print emergency liquidity. Losses are socialized. Profits remain private. Each crisis strengthens the deal instead of breaking it. Because after every collapse, governments emerge more indebted, and banks emerge more indispensable. The public hears the same explanation every time. There was no alternative, but alternatives existed, just not for those in power. Fallout: who pays the real price? The fallout doesn't arrive as a single explosion. It arrives slowly. Inflation erodes savings. Taxes rise without improving services. Public assets are privatized. Social programs are reformed. Citizens are told the country is broke. But here's the paradox. Money never disappeared. It was redirected. Interest payments flow upward. Assets concentrate. Debt becomes a lifetime sentence passed from one generation to the next. People blame politicians. Politicians blame markets. Markets quietly enforce the deal. Failed fixes, WHY reforms never work. Governments promise reforms all the time. Austerity, stimulus, debt ceilings, balanced budgets. But none of these fix the root problem. Because the problem isn't spending, it's who creates money and who it serves. Long as money enters the economy as debt owed to banks, the cycle cannot end. Reforms treat symptoms while protecting the agreement itself. And any politician who challenges the deal faces consequences: capital flight, market panic, or sudden loss of confidence. The system doesn't need force, it uses incentives. Modern parallels: the pattern repeats today. Global debt has surpassed levels once considered impossible. Countries owe more than their entire annual output. Interest payments rival defense budgets. Central banks quietly backstop markets indefinitely. The language has changed, but the deal hasn't. Digital currencies, emergency lending, quantitative easing, new names, same structure. And every crisis accelerates the timeline. What once took centuries now happens in years. 3 key takeaways. First, governments are not broke, they are structurally dependent. Second, debt is not a mistake, it's the mechanism. Third, the real power lies not in laws but in money creation. Final warning and call to action: the secret deal between banks and governments was never voted on. It was never debated publicly. It was never meant to be understood by the people paying for it. The real danger isn't collapse, it's normalization. Debt feels normal, when inflation feels inevitable, and control feels invisible. If you understand the system, you can see the patterns. If you see the patterns, you stop blaming the wrong people. And if this story made you question what you were taught about money, debt, and power, stay curious. Because the most dangerous systems are the ones you're never told exist. If you want more deep dives into hidden financial history and economic paradoxes, make sure you're subscribed. The next story goes even deeper.